All right, so carrying on with where we left off, we were talking about some of those older perspectives, right? We were looking at let me see if I can find this for you real quick. Your big takeaways. So we talked about the historical psych, like the Greek and Enlightenment thinkers, dualism versus monoism. And then we talked about some of those early perspectives, how Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology, starts it off doing actual research. And then those under him, like Titchener and Hall, go back to the US or stay in Europe and develop what would become modern psychology, right? All the modern fields of psychology. Initially, it was structuralism versus functionalism, and then structuralism, because of introspection, fades. Functionalism takes over as the most popular, but even that kind of devolves and changes into many other fields like evolutionary, psychodynamic, behaviorism, Gestalt, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So today, let's focus on these other early perspectives. There are three of those early perspectives. Today we're going to talk about these as well as modern perspectives, which are the biggies you should know. But these early perspectives that started us off, remember, functionalism and structuralism both count as early perspectives, and these are the other three. So you'd have 5 total early perspectives: structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and Gestalt. Okay, so psychoanalysis is one that most people know and a lot of people think of as psychology. This is also known as Freudian psychology. It was the first to really popularize the field on a national level or international level. Freud became one of them, a household name in many ways, and his belief was that our behaviors are all a result of some form of subconscious thought, oftentimes something that we don't even know of, but it's a subconscious desire that is manifesting from deep in our childhood or something that happened in our past. The second biggie, another one that became very popular, was Watson and Skinner's behaviorism. Pavlov probably is the most famous study, though, with his dog study, and we'll talk about all of those when we get to the behaviorism unit. But they emphasized that science, if psychology was a science, and in the early 1900s, science was difficult. They didn't have electrodes. They weren't able to study what was going on in the brain yet. And so they said, we have to do actual science. We need to make this observable, right? If Freud is over here talking to people and asking them about, like, tell me about your mother, from that, I can guess that it's guesses. It's guesswork. It's not true science, right? It's all discussion. And so it's a lot harder to make objective claims. With behaviorism, you can. So Watson, Skinner, Pavlov emphasized that everything is observable and that our behavior is based on science and some point, whether we are rewarded or punished for what we do. And then the third one is Gestalt. This is Max Wertheimer, and I'm sorry if you aren't able to see that well, but ultimately what he was saying is that to get to an understanding of human experience, that we kind of have to take everything into account. We can't just look at behavior. We can't just look at psychoanalysis. Gestalt was saying that context matters. That's the big idea of Gestalt. And it's big on perspective. It's how we see the world. It's not just physically, both like with our eyes, but also how then we process and think about that. So let's talk about some examples of all of those. First, psychoanalysis really breaks down into this like iceberg is the most famous example in how you could best understand psychoanalysis. Freud believed that our consciousness, what we could process when we're looking around you, right? Like you noticing this like clock above my head, the wall behind me, whatever, like noticing the things around you, what you're conscious of is only a small figment of our experience. Most of what's happening is in our subconscious. It's below and we don't notice it. Ego, superego, and id. Again, this is all super high over. You don't have to know this in depth quite yet, but ultimately it's our unconscious and our preconscious that's really driving us and that forms who we are, whereas our conscious is only a small piece of us, our ego and our superego. Okay. The behaviorism of Watson, Skinner, Pavlov breaks down into operant and classical conditioning. This is one that you probably have you at least have an idea of what it is, unlike some of the other ones. Classical conditioning, if you've ever seen The Office, Jim uses the Pavlov's dog study to condition Dwight at the sound of a bell. Operant conditioning is very much like pushing a button things like that. So classical conditioning is associating things together, right? So like the sound of a bell and food often means that your mouth is going to salivate. Operant conditioning is when an action happens, some form of reaction happens, and then we base everything on either rewards or punishments. So again, behaviorism, big idea is that everything comes down to our actions and then the outcomes of those actions, whether it's classical being paired with something else or operant, what's coming afterwards. That means that's what behaviorism is based on. And then Gestalt, really, like I said, the big idea of what you need to know for Gestalt is that context matters. So for instance, if you are on the street and you see an older person just sprinting right at you in the middle of a dark alley, you're like, this is really bad. If, however, you are on a track and you see a guy running right at you, you're not going to think he's probably going to steal all my stuff. You're like, he's exercising. This is normal. Where we are and how we perceive things matters. Okay, so the context changes things. And Gestalt became famous with these different forms of Gestaltian figures where they would say like, what do you see here, right? And naturally your brain sees that as a triangle, but of course there's no triangle there, right? There are three shapes, right? There are three different unfilled circles, right? That's not a triangle, but our brain fills this in, right? If you look really hard, you likely begin to think there might actually be a line there, but there's not. Our brain is just doing that, okay? That's something that we can process and consciously know there's no triangle, but we still see a triangle. Okay, these like brain teasers, what like tricks our eyes. This is something that falls into Gestalt psychology. So these again are early perspectives, some of the like OGs, the founders of psychology. Okay, so big takeaways: historical psych, early perspectives in psych. Today we've talked about those other three: Freudian or psychodynamic behaviorism and Gestalt. So now. Firstly, this is in the PowerPoint. If you need help, if you want to go back and really look at these, or if you need help filling out your vocab, this is a great place to look. Big resources of all of the big names that you're going to need to know for the AP test. So let's talk about contemporary psych, and we're going to do this in a bit of an interesting way. So today, psychology is broken down into seven key fields that you absolutely have to know. And this is what we're going to be coming back to a lot, right? Like I'm not going to reference Gestalt a lot going forward, okay? I'm not going to reference functionalism or structuralism really ever again after this unit, unless we're like referencing it as a, remember in unit 1? So these, however, we will reference a lot, right? Like most of these have their own unit that we're going to be talking about even. So these are the 7 fields you absolutely have to know. So let's go over these in a way that I am going to eventually ask you to do in class on Thursday, maybe on Tuesday if we have time, probably Thursday. But I'll do it in a way that makes sense to me, which is to break down a character that we know and love. You can do this with yourself, but oftentimes when we start analyzing those we love or ourselves and thinking about it in realms of therapy, we like the WebMD effect, we begin to think there's something wrong with those around us or ourselves. So let's do this with someone that is a fictional character. Or if there is maybe if you like have an obsession with a celebrity or a person of history, you can go with that if you know their story really, really well. Like you can try that. But try to do it with someone fictional that you know. For me, near and dear to my heart is Mr. Harry James Potter. I grew up reading the stories. I went to the midnight release of all of the last 4 books. Our dog's name is Padfoot, who's a character in the stories. So I'm going to talk about Harry through the perspective of each one of these 7 themes and how a psychodynamic or how a behavioral or how a cognitive psychologist might talk about Harry and look at some of the things that he may need therapy for, which Harry definitely probably needed some therapy and didn't get it. Wizarding World was not great with emotions or mental issues. Their mental health was definitely not taken care of well. So let's talk about Harry. 1, psychodynamic. We've kind of talked about that one already, right? This is Freudian. It's not super popular anymore. We're not going to talk a lot about it. There's no unit for it, but there are still psychodynamic psychologists. They focus on, remember, subconscious or unconscious drives and conflicts. And they're thinking about like repression, things that happened to you in your past that you're trying to ignore, trauma, really difficult things in our childhood. They like to think about your dreams and figure out what that means. Harry is a reservoir of all kinds of subconscious and unconscious things. He literally, for those of you, spoiler alert, have read or seen the movies, he has a piece of the Dark Lord's soul etched onto him from a trauma where he was attempted to be murdered as a baby. So psychodynamic is all over him. A psychodynamic psychologist would say, your dreams often have the Dark Lord in them. You often believe that you see what the Dark Lord is doing. You have these memories of your childhood where you see a green flash and you hear your mother scream whenever you are murdered. Like, you have all of these repressed memories and traumas, and a therapist would try to flush those out, talk about them, and recognize them so that they could grow out of those. Okay, so it's all about repression and hidden memories. Second, behavioral is somebody that is looking at behavior and how we learn that behavior. Okay, so we're going to focus more on Harry once he gets to school and how his behaviors change and shifts. And they're looking at rewards and punishments. Everything is cause and effect with behavioral, right? It was early. They didn't have deep like brain science yet, but they were looking at what you did and what happened afterwards. So for Harry, rewards and punishments, my favorite example of this is that Harry in his first year of school is told all of these rules and then breaks every single one of the rules, right? Like in the very first week of school, right? Dumbledore and, or I guess Madam Hooch technically, it's like the first rule is that first years cannot have brooms. And at the like practice on the first day where they're teaching first years to fly a broom, they're like, if you get on that broom, you will be expelled tomorrow. And Harry's like, I do what I want. Gets on his broom, flies off, nearly gets himself and another student killed. And what happens? His headmaster pulls him aside, McGonagall, the head of his house, and says, that was pretty good. I'm going to make you the captain of the Quidditch team, even though you're not allowed to have brooms, and we've never had a first year on the team, and that's not allowed, but we're going to make an exception for sports. And so Harry gets to do whatever he wants. And so he learns, he's like, well, there are rules, but I don't have to follow them because I'm special. And so Harry realizes that he can do whatever he wants. At the end of the other rules they said, don't go in the trap door. What's he do? He goes in the trap door twice. Second time, he and his 3 friends earn like 9,000 points for the house, and they win the house cup. So he learns that he doesn't have to follow the rules because he always gets rewarded when he breaks the rules instead of punished. 3, humanistic. They're focusing on our desire for self-fulfillment and finding our purpose in life, right? A lot of times therapists are going to be humanistic psychologists. What they're looking at is looking at how we try to find love and acceptance. So for Harry to think about his childhood, his parents died and he was forced to live with his aunt and uncle who were miserable people. They never gave him acceptance, love. They treated him as inferior. They made him live in a broom closet under the stairs, right? They gave him food, they gave him shelter, but they never accepted him and they treated him like crap his whole life. So he was never going to be able to be happy through the humanistic psychology. So a humanistic psychologist would look at that and say, let's talk about and find other routes. Look for your friends. Look to get out of this toxic relationship. And Harry often did. He found love and acceptance through his friends and through his school and through his other home, the families that he chose, through Hermione and Ron, Dumbledore and McGonagall, rather than the family he was given, the Dursleys. Cognitive psychology is about our mental processes. It's very biological. It's a very modern. It's the more new versions of psychology, and it's focusing on changing our thought processes in some way. Right? Let me go back to cognitive. There we go. So it's how we're processing information. It's going to talk through like the steps that we think about when we get new information. So oftentimes Harry was someone that like he rushes into every single thing he sees, and it often led him into traps because he had such a hero complex. And so a cognitive therapist would say, hey, let's try the next time you see something small, stop, think. Is this an immediate issue? Do I need to solve this or should I ask for help? Am I the best person? So it changes your thought process. Okay. And the thought is that eventually this kind of rewires our brain and we recognize maybe I don't need to be a hero in every single thing. Biological psychology is focusing on the hard wiring of our brain, the chemistry things. This is oftentimes psychiatry is going to fall into this, the actual medical side of psychology. We'll have a full unit on biological psych. So biological psych would, for instance, look at Harry at the beginning of the 6th book after, again, spoiler alert, his uncle dies, is murdered in front of him, right when he finally thinks he's going to get away from the Dursleys and live a good life with his new uncle that he just found. His uncle is murdered, and he spends the whole first half of the 6th book probably depressed, right? Really mad at everyone around him, mad at Dumbledore, mad at those that didn't help him, that didn't do anything, and that didn't give him the information he needed, and it was kind of his fault. And so he is ultimately depressed really that they don't talk about it or call it that in the book, but he definitely was and needed some form of medication because the wizarding world didn't do anything about it, right? He likely needed some form of depression medication. Biological psych would be doing that. Evolutionary, this one is not super common. There are evolutionary psychologists, but this is mostly focusing on why we would do things, like why it would be that we would, from an evolutionary perspective, go about doing things. So that would be looking at the genes that you have, right? Like anytime they talk about like Harry and his eyes, and that you have your mother's eyes, that could be something that an evolutionary psychologist would do. This is going to be more things about like very primitive things that humans do, more of our animalistic behaviors. Don't need to worry about this one as much, but it's much more about survival, right? How we automatically, when we lash out and try to like protect ourselves or have reflexes, which Harry often did against Voldemort or the Dark Lord. He was kind of living out these evolutionary forms. And finally, sociocultural. This is how people vary across situations, cultures. It's basically like look at how you could look at the Muggles or humans and look at the wizards and how they did things. Harry had to basically learn a whole new culture. I love you talk about like his best friend's dad, Ron's dad, has no idea how humans interact. And so when he goes into a new house, he's like, "Can I borrow your Felitone?" It's like, and he doesn't know how to use it and like breaks things all the time. And they're judging each other, even though they both have their own skills, right? Like none of the wizards know how to drive a car, but they can literally do magic. Whereas the humans have like all these cool new technologies, but the wizards are way behind on in some way. So it's looking at different cultures and how people react to things. And so people could look at Harry and say, you were raised in this culture of humans, and then now you this culture of wizards, and initially you weren't accepted, right? The Draco Malfoys looked at him and said, like, you're not really one of us. And so he had to learn to fit in and to either assimilate or be challenged, and challenge that his whole life. So we've got these 7 different ones. I'm going to ask you in class on Thursday to try to do this with a small group, pick any character you all want, and try to do some analysis. And ultimately with psychology, the big idea of what you're going to need to know is that it's not any one of these. Okay, I'm going to say this over and over again, but it's not any one of these. It is, and I'm going to say this word a lot, biopsychosocial. Biopsychosocial, one word. The biopsychosocial approach is the ultimate psychology approach, and it's taking them all into account. Okay, it's recognizing that who Harry is, who the person that he is, Harry Potter, is not just the fact that his parents died and he was traumatized by it. It's not just the fact that he had a terrible childhood. It's not just the fact that he was raised in a certain culture, right? We are defined by everything, right? We are defined by our genes. Part of us is our genetics. Part of us is our brain structure. Part of us is the relationship we have with our parents and our behavioral things that were taught to us as a child, right? Like we're all of those things. Okay, and we have to recognize every single one of them if we're going to really understand someone, and if we want to answer that question of if people are good or evil, right? And if you've read Harry Potter, and if you're obsessed with it as I am, you know that the basis of the entire story is recognizing that there is choice, right? And that people aren't really born good or evil, that they are a product of their environments. Even the Dark Lord is a product of a terrible childhood, but still ultimately was given many, many choices to not live that life. Just as Harry was given many choices to live a darker or a harder life or an easier life, and he tried to always choose the right way. So biopsychosocial is recognizing that it's all of those things, biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors influencing both our physical behaviors and our mental processes. Okay, it's a lot to take in, but this is really like the whole course. Everything we're going to do is going to be giving us more details to help us answer questions from the biopsychosocial approach. So that is 1.1. It's a doozy. It's lots and lots of stuff. 1.2, but that's most of the 1.2 will be very quick. It's going to be going over the domains of psych, and they're a little bit less important. But these 7 are must knows. Okay, so if nothing else, get these 7 because we're going to be talking about them all year. You've got to have a basic understanding of the going forward. I will see you all when I see you in class. Thanks for sticking with me, and with that, I will see you later.